coming in today because of the Brad Paisley concert in the Save-Mart Center. But no worries here. The parking is free on Friday, so you can always remember it's just a matter of finding the parking. I'm just going to spend a few minutes going over some of our upcoming events before I formally introduce our guest speakers. This semester, as usual, the Armenian Studies program is involving a wide variety of activities and programs, of which only just a few are up on this board this evening. But I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Well, I should back that up. Some of you know that every year the Armenian Studies program invites a Kazan visiting professor in Armenian Studies. And this year I'm happy to say that our 14th Kazan visiting professor in Armenian Studies is Dr. Yektan Turkyilmaz, who's here from Berlin, Germany. And Dr. Turkyilmaz, would you just stand up for a moment? Let's have a round of applause. Please make sure to meet with him afterwards and to talk with him. He's going to be giving 3 very interesting lectures during the course of the semester. And the first one will be on Tuesday, February the 6th. And it's going to be about the Armenians of the area of Van Vaspuragan. And it's about their cultural history, their political history, really from the 19th century through the time of the Armenian genocide. It's called Van Armenians, Van Vaspuragan Armenians, from Renaissance to resistance to genocide. We're going to have a reception before that, so at 6:30 out in the gallery we'll have food and drinks, so we'd like to welcome you to put that on your calendar to come a little bit early before the lecture, have a chance to talk to the speaker, and also just have something to eat before the lecture. The next lecture after that, on February 23rd, is going to be by Ara Sarafian, who is the director of the Gomidas Institute. He's coming from London to speak also about Van, as it turns out, because he's published a new translation of one of the most important eyewitness histories of the events of Van of 1915. And he'll be here on February the 23rd. And then we're going to change gears, because on Friday, March the 2nd, we're going to have a really wonderful concert. So if you love classical and also Armenian music, the Chilingirian Bagratuni Hagopian Trio. It's going to be Levon Chilingirian on a violin, Bagratuni on the cello, and Hagopian on the piano. They'll be performing as part of the keyboard concert series on Friday, March the 2nd. That does require tickets, and it's going to be in the concert hall on campus. The other 2 lectures will be right here in the same place that we are. And then on March the 7th will be Professor Turkyilmaz's second lecture, which again will be quite different. It's going to be Armenians on records. That is, it's going to be all about the Armenian production of records and how Armenian music and records changed from the homeland in the time of the 19th and 20th century to the period of the diaspora. So how Armenian music has been spread throughout the diaspora. So that will be his second lecture, and that's going to be on Wednesday, March the 7th, here in this hall. And then on March the 18th will be the Armenian Studies Program 30th Annual Banquet. It's kind of hard to picture, and I have some of you who were here when we had the first Armenian Studies Annual Banquet way back in, I think it was 1986, that we had the first one. This is annually the most important event that we hold, in the sense that it brings our students and our faculty, administrators, just everyone together to enjoy an evening and really celebrate the achievements of our students and of the program. Well, following that, we have actually more events, but that's not the time to do that. So, yes?
Where can we get tickets for the trio?
Great. So, for the Chilingirian Bagratuni Hagopian Trio, the best way to get tickets beforehand is to go online, and you can just search for keyboard concerts, and at the keyboard concert site, you'll find the tickets. By the way, any of you that are on Facebook, if you follow the Armenian Studies program on Facebook, we have the link there, and also in our emails that we send out. So you can get those tickets online. I would suggest you get them early, because those concerts do sell out. That concert in particular, I'm sure, will be selling out. Okay, so let's start this evening again. Just to say that today is the second in our spring lecture series of the Armenian Studies program. And I again want to especially thank the Leon S. Peters Foundation, which has been continually supporting this series for the past 5 years. Tonight's presentation by Dr. Porta and Dr. Vacca is on an Armenian narrative on early Islam, Ghevond's history. And I'm just going to switch over to that now. And basically, and of course you're going to hear the lecture, but basically this covers the period when Armenia became a province of the Islamic Caliphate in the 7th century. And it's really surrounding the story of the history of a very important Armenian historian by the name of Ghevond. Ghevond Vartabed. Vartabed is the priest in the Armenian church with the doctorate. And both Dr. Porta and Dr. Alison, Vacca, our special guest, will take an interdisciplinary look at this history by putting it in context. So often we think of Armenian history as being something isolated or marginal. I think tonight we're going to see that Armenian history is very much a part of the entire region, and they will situate it within the Armenian Christian and Arabic Islamic historical traditions. They will not only address the perceptions of Armenian perceptions of the circumstances of Islamic rule in Armenia, but they also will speculate on the relationship between Armenian and Arabic historical texts. That's enough. I think they'll tell you more about it in the lecture. I'd like to just introduce them briefly to give you a little bit of background. Dr. Sergio Porta is the Haig and Isabel Berberian Professor of Armenian Studies, and this year we're sharing him. So he is also the chair of the Department of Philosophy for this year. So he's got kind of a double duty that he's working. His areas of research include medieval Armenian intellectual and political history, philology, and apocalyptic literature. And he has many, many publications, of which the most recent is a co-edited volume with Dr. Kevork Bardakhshan on the Armenian apocalyptic tradition, a comparative perspective, which was published in 2014. Dr. Porta is also the editor of the Journal of the Society for Armenian Studies. Dr. Alison Vacca is here from Knoxville, Tennessee. She's an assistant professor of history at the University of Tennessee and author of Non-Muslim Provinces Under Early Islam, Islamic Rule and Iranian Legitimacy in Armenian and Caucasian Albania. She's interested in the area of early Islamic rule over Armenia, intercommunal conflict, and the relationship between Arabic and Armenian texts. And she has a new book project which investigates the role of women as cultural mediators in the medieval Caucasus. So tonight, both Dr. Porta and Dr. Vacca will be speaking. We're going to start with Dr. Porta, so let's warmly welcome Dr. Sergio Porta.
Thank you, Barlow. Thank you all for coming this evening. I'm sure Ghevond would be really pleased. This is probably the biggest audience he's ever had, even when he was alive. I don't think he had this many people listening to him. I'd also like to thank Alison. This is the first time I've ever done a joint talk like this, so we'll see how it goes. I first met Alison over 10 years ago when I was still teaching at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, when this girl from Rochester, New York came up and said that she wanted to learn classical Armenian. And that's how I first met her. She was the best student I had ever had. She has gone on. She went on to get a PhD from the University of Michigan under Kevork Bardakhshan for Armenian. And now is an associate professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. It's been a long and fabulous journey from student to colleague, and it's both an honor and a real pleasure to do this with her. She's fantastic and is definitely one of the brightest stars, not only in Armenian history, but also in Islamic history. So pay attention to her publications as they come out. In 788, turn this on. In 788, an Armenian monastic priest and teacher named Ghevond was commissioned by Shapu, a member of the Armenian noble family of the Badratuni, to reflect upon the previous 150 years of history. Much had changed for Armenia and Armenians since the 630s. If you had been taking stock in Armenia in the early 630s, your perspective would likely still have been dominated by the ongoing rivalry between the Byzantine and Sasanian empires that had split Armenia unequally between the two of them since the end of the 4th century. Little would you have expected that Arab tribesmen, following a monotheistic religion indebted to, but very distinct from, Judaism and Christianity, would, between August and November of 636, defeat both of these great empires in battle. That's really a remarkable feat in that short period of time, August and November the Arab tribes that came out defeated the two largest empires of the region, right, successively. It's not an easy thing to do. And that by the middle of the century, the Sasanian dynasty, which had been around for over 400 years, right, for all intents and purposes, would have exited the stage of world history. The rapid conquest of nearly all of what we call the Middle East, including Armenia and North Africa, by Arab Muslims, raised the question for Armenian political elites of how they fit within the new political order of the Caliphate. 788 was an appropriate moment to look back upon the transformations that had occurred, as enough time had passed for an observer to realize that the emergence of the Caliphate was not a flash-in-the-pan event, but a political reality that had to be seriously considered. But 788 was also a necessary moment to analyze Caliphal rule in Armenia, because of recent revolutionary changes within the Caliphate itself that called the policies and loyalties of Armenian elites into question. In 750, descendants of an uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, known as the Abbasids, based in the eastern province of Khorasan, led disgruntled Muslim subjects of the Caliphate and successfully overthrew the Umayyad dynasty that had been in power for nearly 90 years. Political revolutions are a tricky matter. On the one hand, the instability and confusion they create provide space and leverage for seizing opportunities. On the other, those same factors increase risk and disturb the waters through which leaders have to navigate. One place elites may look for assistance in charting their course forward is the past, to see if historical experience can help illuminate the dark skies ahead. Ghevond's history was intended to be precisely this sort of beacon. So what was the secret path that Ghevond revealed to his patron? We're going to keep you in a little bit of suspense about that, but we will touch upon it later, so don't hold your breath, but we will get there. We would like you to know that in reviewing the century and a half of Armenian history, Ghevond sheds singular and important light on early Islamic rule in the Caucasus. His history is the only contemporary history of 8th century Armenia. Even in the Arabic tradition, the earliest great compilations of Baladri and Tabari date to the late 9th and 10th centuries. And it is for that reason that Dr. Alison, Vacca, and I have teamed up to present a new English translation, textual edition, and commentary of this work. And this evening, we will share a bit of the fruit of that collaboration. In the first part of this duet, I will first talk about the earliest manuscript of Ghevond's history. Then I will try to place the work in its literary context. That is, where and how does it fit in with other Armenian histories, and how does it differ from them? And following that, I will mention some characteristic elements of the work, and finally, I will let you in on Ghevond's counsel to his Bagrachuni patron. Dr. Vacca will then pick up the reins and discuss how this Armenian source relates to early Islamic histories and how Ghevond's work reflects ongoing conversations between Armenians and Arabs. So, the earliest copy of Ghevond's history is contained within Matanadaran manuscript 1902, right, of the Matanadaran library in Yerevan, Armenia. The manuscript is a miscellany, that is a collection of different texts written on paper, copied between 1274 and 1311 at the monastery of Hovanavank. And that's a picture of, I'm going to change the lighting here. I think I want to be on this one. That is a picture of the monastery of Hovanavank on the Kazakh Gorge. Some of you may have visited it. It's very near Sakhmosavank, which is also on that gorge. The manuscript contains 315 folios with dimensions of about 24.5 by 16.5 centimeters. So it's a good sized manuscript, nice sized manuscript. The main scribe was named Sarkis, and the patron of the manuscript was the abbot of the monastery. His name was Hamazast Mamagonian. Ghevond's history appears first in the manuscript and occupies folios 3 verso to 130 verso. So when we deal with manuscripts, we talk about this page is the recto, and the next page is the verso, and you only number the recto pages. So this is recto 5, this is folio 5 recto. When you turn it over, it's 5 verso. So this manuscript occupies 3 verso to 130 verso. It is followed by the works of Vagrius of Pontus, while the final text in the manuscript is a copy of the Georgian Chronicles. And interestingly enough, this is also the earliest preserved manuscript of the Georgian Chronicles, whether in Armenian or in Georgian. This is the earliest copy. There are later copies of Ghevond's history as well, but they are all ultimately dependent upon this one, which means that even though it was copied 500 years after the original was made, this is still our best witness to that text. And it is possible that the original even served as the exemplar, that is, the copy that the original was the text from which the scribe copied this text for this manuscript, as it preserves Ghevond's colophon. A colophon is a note at the end of a text saying, this text was written by such and such, or this is the work of such and such done in this date. This manuscript preserves that original note of the author, Ghevond, as well as the final note of the scribe. But those are the only two it has, so it is possible that the scribe Sarkis was working off of the original. A curious feature of this manuscript, I love this, is a note that appears in the bottom margin of folio 32 verso. You can sort of see it here. See this note down here, right? This is actually, in fact, upside down, so we should flip it, and now you can see it up here. Right? Sort of, can you make it out? Now, what the heck is that? All right, Alison and I realized fairly quickly that the writing was neither Arabic nor Syriac, as people had mentioned, because Alison's a specialist in Arabic. She couldn't make heads or tails out of it. I know Syriac. I couldn't make heads or tails out of it. So what the heck is it? We thought that it was possibly a Central Asian or Manichaean script, and it proved that we were right. We sent the folio to a friend who then posted it to an online. I love this because it also shows like modern scholarship at work and how communication is so impossible and how we can actually use nefarious internet tools to our benefit. We sent it, who posted it to an online blog, and within 24 hours, we had an analysis of this from several scholars from around the world, right? And different scholars came in asserting that it was Uyghur, used by the Mongolian chancellery, which makes perfect sense for this amount of time. And in fact, one scholar, Dai Matsui, said the script could very well be 13th to 14th century. This is independent of having any information from us, so that, you know, the date of 1274 to 1311, perfect. And soon we also had a translation by Peter Zime and Mark Dickens. Basically, it says, one should praise the eternal God. This book is in of Hovana Monastery. And one of the things I did like was that these scholars were having a hard time deciphering the second line. And they finally said, you know, does something like Hovana Vank make any sense in Armenia? And I was like, yes, it does. Thank you very much. Cha-ching. I have a whole other talk on what I think why there's a Mongolian note in this manuscript. That's completely different. All right. Okay. So how does Ghevond's text fit within or into the Armenian historiographical tradition? How does it relate to the text that came before it and after it? So during the second half of the 5th and the early 6th centuries, a series of chronologically focused histories provide a picture of Armenian culture and society from the Christianization of the monarchy to the Armenian rebellions against the Sasanian Empire in the second half of the 5th century. The history attributed to the elusive Agatangaros recounts the story of the conversion of the Arsacid king of Armenia, Tirdat, to Christianity by Gregory the Illuminator at the beginning of the 4th century. The epic histories, or Buzandaran, attributed to Paustos, written around 470, continues the narrative from the descendants of Tirdat to the partition of Armenia between Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire in 387. The late 5th century history of Ghazar Parpitsi concentrates on the period between 387 and 485. You can see we're building up a chain of histories there that create a narrative. His narrative discusses the fall of the Armenian Arsacid monarchy, the end of Gregory's family's hold on the Patriarchate, and the Armenian revolts led by the Mamagonian family against the Sasanian Empire in 450-451, and then again in 481 to 484. The war against the Sasanians in 450 to 451, spearheaded by Vartan Mamagonian, received renewed treatment by Yechishe in the late 5th or early 6th century. And this is actually a famous illustration of that battle. You can see the nice elephants up here from the Persian side. These are part of a famous manuscript cycle of illuminations for this text that another student, Aaron Pinion, is working on. The rebellion had been this is one of the ironies of Armenian history. The rebellion had been a significant military loss, right, for the Armenian forces, as many of the rebellion's leaders, including Vartan himself, were killed at the Battle of Avarayr in May of 451, while the others were led away into captivity. So it was actually, if you were sitting around at 452, it was really a, oh my God, what are we going to do now? Moment. The entire leadership of Armenia had either been eliminated or imprisoned. So Yechishe's task was to convert this physical defeat, this physical humiliation, into a spiritual victory. He so successfully achieved his desired purpose that his account emerged as the dominant perspective of the rebellion in the Armenian tradition and remains so to this day. Hardly anybody reads Chazar Parpatsi for this, even though his actual historical information may be preferable to Yechishe's in places. But Yechishe really does a job on this, and he's an incredible author, and it has a much more powerful narrative. And so much so, not only because it remains popular today, it also served as the model for the depiction of the caliphate in later Armenian sources. So we can see later Armenian historians picking up how Yechishe describes the Sasanian Empire, and they just basically cut and paste it to describe the Arab Caliphate. Both Ghazar's work and Yechishe's work, both of these texts, were commissioned by members of the Mamagonian family. And it is thus unsurprising that the works emphasize the role of that family in Armenia's historical narrative. And basically, the Mamagonian emerged from these texts as the preeminent Armenian noble family and the defenders of Armenian independence and of Armenianness in many respects. After a hiatus in historical writing, the 7th century history attributed to Sebeos addresses the 180-year period between the Armenian rebellions of the 480s and the first Arab civil war that ended in 661. So he sort of brings the chain down. We now have pretty much a continual historical narrative that starts from the early 4th century and goes down to 661. The work exhibits a discernible shift, however, away from the centrality of the Mamagonian in Armenian affairs and towards the rising Bagratuni family. The anonymous author contextualizes Armenian history within the complex relations between the Byzantine and the Sasanian empires, and is the first Armenian historian to analyze the rise of Islam and the early Islamic conquests. It is this work that immediately precedes that of Ghevond, in which the latter then brings down to 788, or his time. Ghevond's method and approach bears many similarities with those of his predecessors. Like them, he proceeds chronologically through his topic, and he addresses a specific period of time, bringing his history down to his own day. Similar, too, is that he foregrounds the family of his patron, in this case, the Bagratuni. But one would not describe his work as a family history, nor does he limit his geographic scope to his particular region or province, such as the later works of Tovma Artsruni or Moses Daskoransi. So he's sort of at the end of this tradition of this broad interpretation or broad understanding of Armenian history. It still has a patron and focuses on one family, sort of is paramount in the text, but nonetheless it's not devoted solely to that family. So he, on the one hand, looks and continues that chain of histories. In other respects, however, Ghevond differs markedly from his predecessors. First of all, he organizes his history according to caliphal reign, right? Not Byzantine emperors, not Armenian kings or princes, but according to caliphs. In fact, he is the only Armenian historian to organize his text according to caliphal reign. In addition, after mentioning each caliph, he provides a brief biographical sketch of that ruler. So Caliph such and such, right? He lived 20 years, he did this and this, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, then he died. Right? This technique is again unparalleled in other Armenian histories. Both of these characteristics, however, are shared with the developing Muslim Arabic historiographical tradition, to which we'll return in a moment, and exemplify the degree to which Ghevond was integrated into the Islamic world around him. Okay, let's turn to some characteristic features of the text. One characteristic feature of Ghevond's text, something we may even call a bias of the author, is his clear predisposition towards the early Umayyad caliphs known as the Sufyanids. Ghevond reveals this tendency at the outset of his work, when discussing the submission of Armenia to caliphal control. Now, I mentioned that Sebios is really the first person to treat the Arabic incursions into Armenia. He ends his history in 661, and there it falls off. But he does talk about how Armenia submitted to caliphal control. And he describes it in the following manner. In 652, following a coordinated Muslim invasion and not seeing any help coming from Byzantium, Theodore Rishtuni, Prince of Armenia, decided to strike a deal with the governor of Syria, Muawiyah, later a caliph. The author designated this treaty as, quote, a covenant with death and an alliance with hell. All right? Clearly, he did not think that this was a good deal. He wanted to renegotiate the treaty. By contrast, Ghevond does not denigrate the treaty. Instead, he prefaces the decision to submit with an episode that highlighted Byzantine stupidity and arrogance. He also explicitly records that the idea to accept the terms offered by the caliphate was initiated by Catholicos Nerses III. That is, this was not done something against the will of the church, but it was actually instigated by the will of the church, who garnered the support of the Armenian nobility, so in concert with the rest of the Armenian elite. He is also at pains to point out that after Rishtuni died in 654, Muawiyah appointed Grigor Mamagonian as the Prince of Armenia, and that there was peace during his reign. We know from other sources that that wasn't necessarily the case because of invasions of the Khazars that come in, but regardless, he describes this period almost as a golden age of Armenian peace where it was able to reestablish itself. So according to Ghevond, relations with the caliphate only begin to deteriorate during the reign of Abd al-Malik, right, who reigned from 684 to 705, and his descendants. Right? The Second Islamic Civil War, or Fitna, in the 680s and 90s, was followed by centralizing reforms across the caliphate in the 690s. The Armenians had taken advantage of the Second Civil War to rebel in the late 680s, and again in response to Abd al-Malik's reforms in 702, and at the end of Abd al-Malik's reign in 705. One of the things that Abd al-Malik established was Islamic currency. He took the denarius of Greece and made it the dinar, and made an iconic, that is, there are no pictures, coins with quotes from the Quran. This was sort of controversial, but he succeeded in doing that. He also built the Dome of the Rock, right? And tried to turn Islam not into a purely just an Arab religion, but tried to put it on the map as a world religion. And his reforms are controversial, but they actually put the caliphate on a very steady foot in many respects. Right? But nonetheless, they were not greeted with joy, because they did require some sort of harmonization, right, and normalization of practices, which was to the detriment of people who had had a better deal under the Sufyanids, including the Armenians. And the issue of an increasing tax burden against the caliphate as it's expanding, right, needs more and more taxes in order to maintain that. It's also losing its tax base as more people convert to Islam. They no longer pay the jizya, so they're losing tax people at the same time, and so they start increasing. They also have a larger empire. They have much more infrastructure they have to deal with. They start raising taxes. Armenians never liked this, of course, and so we have Ghevond's reaction to this. The issue of an increasing tax burden arises with the reign of Abd al-Malik's son, Hisham, in 724 to 743, and continues to come to the fore in successive reigns. In addition to all of this, from the outside, an intense rivalry between the leaders of the Mamikonian and Bagratuni families also emerges during Hisham's caliphate. The Mamikonian, who had been, as I mentioned, the leading family, were losing prestige to the Bagratuni, and they tried to regain their position as the preeminent Armenian noble family. To this end, they took advantage of dissatisfaction with caliphal tax policy, the Third Arab Civil War, and the Abbasid Revolution, to encourage Armenians to rebel in 750. The rebellion failed, and the Abbasids reasserted control over Armenia. But the Mamikonians again fostered a rebellion in 775, pressuring part of the Bagratuni family to take part. That revolt led to the disastrous Battle of Ghevond that we'll be discussing a little bit later on, or Alison will, at which many of the nobles were killed or captured, and from which the Mamikonian never recovered. So 775 marks really the end of any sort of hope for the Mamikonian to play a prominent role in Armenian political affairs. They now have led two revolts against the caliphate. Both of them failed miserably. Another interesting characteristic about the history is that it shows very little interest in religious controversy, despite the fact that its author was a monastic priest. You think he's a monastic priest, he'd be interested in these religious debates that are going on. Ghevond has nearly nothing to say about the splits inside Christianity, right? Between Chalcedonians, non-Chalcedonians, right? The Severan between, I won't even get into it. Or of the results of any church councils, right? Including that one of the famous Council of Manaskert in 726, in which Armenian canon law is codified, in which Armenian theology is pretty much set for, from that point onwards, right? Nor does he speak of the Second Council of Nicaea of 787, right? Convened while he's actually writing the text. And this was an important one too, because it revolved around the whole issue of iconoclasm, right? That had divided Byzantium by that point for decades. So he doesn't make any mention of those things. And nor does he himself comment on Islam as a religion. He never has himself. I'll get to this in a second. Never really comments on Islam as a religion or any of its tenets, right? But the text, as we now have it, does include a famous correspondence attributed to the Umayyad Caliph Umar II ibn Abdulaziz, who reigned from 717 to 720, and the Byzantine Emperor Leo III, who reigned from 717 to 741, about the veracity of Christianity. Scholars consider the exchange fictional. Like, nobody believes that they were actually the authors of this correspondence, right? But versions of it were quite popular throughout the Mediterranean. The Armenian version was clearly translated from Greek. So we know there's an Armenian version, there was a Greek version from which Armenian was translated, right, even though that's lost now. And we have other versions in Arabic, Christian Arabic, and in Muslim Arabic, medieval Spanish, and Latin. Right? The Armenian version, and these are pictures of each of the different manuscript traditions. The Spanish is actually written in Arabic letters. It's a language known as Al-Hamiyat. The Armenian version preserves both Umar's letter to Leo, questioning the latter about the tenets of and legitimacy of Christianity, as well as Leo's response, assaulting Muslim conceptions of the Christian faith and defending the truth of the Christian revelation. It is still debated whether Ghevond originally included the letter in his work or whether it was inserted later by someone else. We happen to think that Ghevond actually put the letter in. He had access to this translation and put it in, but it is possible that it could have been inserted later. Although when is a question, since our earliest manuscript already has it and seems to be copied from the original. I don't know. It's a problem. Okay, one final characteristic I'll briefly, final characteristic, I forgot to do that, sorry. One final characteristic I'll briefly note, and that is the history's urban focus. Unlike previous historians, Armenian historians, Ghevond spends a lot of time discussing events in cities, particularly that of Dvin. I've highlighted them, I don't know if you can read. Dvin, this is Karnikala, or Theodosiopolis, or Karin, or Erzurum, as you may know it today. Nakhichevan, right? He talks a lot about Nakhchivan, and Darband as well. He mentions events there. As well as Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, would be over here. Right? This is a 3D reconstruction of what the city of Dvin would look like. Right? Based on... really very little archaeological evidence, but nonetheless it gives you an idea of what a medieval Armenian city may have looked like. The attention Ghevond pays to Ghevond is so great that one scholar, Timothy Greenwood at St. Andrews, has even suggested that it may have been Ghevond's hometown. That's speculation, but it's a good guess. Okay. Let's now turn to the message of Ghevond's history. Right? It may not come as a surprise that it is one of patience and caution. Right? Although Ghevond fully believes that Armenia's situation under the Caliphate has undoubtedly worsened since the early Umayyad Caliphates and through its greater integration within the Caliphate, the failed rebellions of the 8th century had left their mark on his thinking. Mamikonian impetuousness had led the Armenian nobility and their own family to destruction. It is not by chance that Ghevond puts the following words into the mouth of Ashot Bagratuni, who counseled against the revolt of 775. He says, on whom, these nobles led by the Mamikonian come to him saying, you have to take part in the rebellion. And he says, this is a stupid idea. Right? On whom are you truly relying? With whose strength and whose force can you resist their insurmountable reign? Right? Basically, next one he says, are you going to think the Byzantines are going to come to your rescue? They too have been defeated by them, and they're not going to help us. Right? The outcome of your deed will be this. Either you will return and submit to them, i.e. the Caliphate, staying silent and living again living again peacefully in your land, or you will be repulsed into flight from your land with all of your families, and abandoning the inheritance of your fathers, your homes, forests, and fields, and even the tombs of your fathers. You will go and live in exile with the king of the Greeks. And these are your first two options. Either you're going to have to come back and beg to come back to your own land, or you're going to stay in exile away from your homeland. If not, right, if you choose to stay and fight, you will fall into the hands of your persecutors one day, and they will take your life away with an unsavory death. So basically, don't be stupid. There is no good ending to this. Either you will be forced to live in exile for the rest of your life, or you'll come back on your hands and knees, right, or you'll be killed. So better not to do anything. Ghevond served his patron's family well. Their continued prudent policies vis-a-vis the Caliphate ensured that they would become the foremost powerful noble house in Armenia. And we can see this throughout this period. The Bagratuni are the ones who are sort of, all right, they're not the best, but we shouldn't revolt against the Caliphate. Right? And because of this, they're the only ones who managed to survive all of these rebellions. And going forward, right, they eventually receive a royal crown of their own. Almost nearly exactly 1 century later. It's 884, 96 years. 1 century after Ghevond completed his work. Okay, so this is his advice. They stuck to it, and it worked out for them. So nearly a century later, they themselves became kings of Armenia, recognized by the Caliphate and by Byzantium. I would now like to pass the microphone to my colleague, Dr. Vacca, who will address Ghevond's history within the perspective of Islamic history. Alison.
All right, thank you, and thanks, Sergio, for starting us off. I'd like to continue. Can you guys hear me? No? You're okay?
Bring the mic closer to you.
Might be easier said than done. Let's try this. How's that? Better? We're good?
Better.
All right, great. So I'd like to continue the discussion on Ghevond from another perspective, which is from Islamic history and specifically the Arabic historical tradition. And I'd like to suggest 2 points tonight. The first is that we should understand Ghevond, like other Christian sources written in the provinces of the Caliphate, as an insider source to Islamic history, and not to set it aside as something different or something other. And second, while Ghevond is clearly building off of Armenian concepts of history and Armenian responses to political events, as Dr. Porta just pointed out, he also shares conversations between Armenian Christians and Arab Muslims. These conversations allow us to place Ghevond in relation to the Arabic Islamic historical tradition. So let's start with the first point. Modern Islamicists have been working to integrate Christian and Muslim source material. And this isn't just a question of finding another perspective or getting another opinion on history, but it's actually fundamental to how we define Islamic history. Is Islamic history a history of Muslims? Or is it a history of the Caliphate? Or is it a history of Islamic civilization? One thing we know for certain, it's not necessarily a history of Muslim-majority provinces. If it were, the entire Umayyad period would cease to be Islamic history. While it is difficult to gauge conversion and demographic shifts with any certainty, based on Arabic biographical dictionaries, most historians recognize that none of the provinces conquered in the 7th century become Muslim majority for at least 2 centuries. So Armenia would have been joined with Syria, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Spain as Christian majority provinces of the Caliphate for centuries after the conquest. So Armenia is not alone in its Christian faith, including during the lifetime of Ghevond. Christian clergy and historians wrote texts that inform us about the circumstances of Islamic rule in Arabic, Greek, Armenian, and Syriac, just to name a few. And these are insider perspectives. They're not outsiders just because they were penned by Christians. Christian authors in Syria, Egypt, and Armenia lived under caliphal rule, and since Christians were the majority in these provinces, it does not make sense to see their writings as an outsider perspective. And Ghevond actually is a really interesting case study for this. First, Ghevond's text appears in the 19th century as Arab incursions into Armenia. That's the title that is provided for the text. But the actual title of the text that's found in the earliest manuscript, the one that we're working on, is as follows. The history of Ghevond, the great Vardapet of the Armenians, concerning the appearance of Mohammed and his followers, how and in what way they ruled the world and were over the Armenian people. That title doesn't really fit on the spine of the book quite as well, so it's easier to shorten it. Ghevond then starts his history by noting, and you can see it, it's not transcribed here, but it's up here, that first and foremost are those who are called the commander of the faithful. So Armenia certainly retains its Christian faith and local power structure in the wake of the Arab conquests, but the exposition of these appears in the context of Islamic empire. Added to this, as Dr. Porta mentioned, Ghevond organized his history along caliphal reign, and he also begins his history with the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632. Further, Ghevond's history does not focus on Armenia exclusively, but also includes significant sections that do not directly concern Armenia. So the author's scope is far wider than his immediate milieu, and for example, the work contains accounts of the ill-fated Umayyad attempts to take Constantinople and a similarly unsuccessful Arab invasion of China. It also discusses the Arab civil wars, the fitnas, and the role of the Quran readers in the death of one of the Umayyad caliphs, and the Arab wars against the Khazars, and the heroes of the Abbasid revolution, along with many other deeds and events that fall outside of Armenian territory. His history, then, should be read not only to inform us about Armenia under the Caliphate, but rather also should inform us about broader discussions of caliphal history writ large. And I included this here with this map because I think it's a pretty interesting marker about how Armenia worked as, or was understood as a caliphal province, largely because this is a geographical text. It's from Istahri, which is written in Arabic. And this is a genre, it's a subset of geographical texts called the Balkhi school. And these texts nearly exclusively only talk about the Islamic world. And they're quite specific about that they are only interested in explaining things about the Islamic world. And yet you can see here the Twin Peaks of Ararat. You can see Lake Van is labeled as the Lake of Armenia here, along with there's Erzurum, and here is Ghevond. So clearly, just as Ghevond explains that he's going to be talking about the Muhammad and his followers and Armenia within that story, we have in the Arabic tradition as well the same sort of expectation that Armenia falls as part of the Caliphate. So part of the process of understanding the relationship between Ghevond and the Islamic world then is also to understand a little bit more about the relationship between Ghevond's history and the Arabic Islamic historiographical tradition. So as Dr. Porta indicated, the main Islamic histories such as Yaqubi, or Masudi, or Tabari were all written in the 9th and 10th centuries. And again, this isn't just a problem for those of us who are interested in Armenian history, but rather all specialists in Umayyad history are going to rely on later texts that were produced in the Abbasid period. We know that Arabic histories existed at the time, including, for example, an Arabic study on the conquest of Armenia, which we would love to have now, but these did not survive except in little snippets that show up in other texts. So Ghevond therefore emerges as a particularly important witness to what's going on in this period. And since we do not have contemporary Arabic texts, scholars have wondered the similarities between Ghevond and these now lost Arabic texts. So, for example, some scholars have pointed out that his reference, as we saw a few slides ago with the title, where he mentioned the caliph by the title Commander of the Faithful. And he does this by just transcribing the Arabic instead of translating it. So he doesn't say it in Armenian. He's just writing out the Arabic in Armenian letters. Could this imply that he was familiar with the Arabic? This is unfortunately really unlikely. Many Greek and Syriac texts render the Amir al-Mu'minin, the title in Arabic, in their own language instead of translating it. So as such, Ghevond might be using the title as he found it in these other Christian sources. Other scholars have pointed to Ghevond's organization by caliphal reign, suggesting that he must have relied on some sort of biography of the caliphs. It's quite sure that such texts did exist and were circulating widely in the Umayyad and early Abbasid periods. These listed the names and the length of reigns of the caliphs and sometimes brief notices about their reigns. And this too is not necessarily a certain sign of Ghevond's familiarity with Arabic, unfortunately. These lists of caliphal biographies appear not only in Arabic, but also in Syriac. And so in order to argue that Ghevond is getting his information from Arabic, we would have to find an actual version that matches up with Ghevond's. That is, skipping the same caliphs that Ghevond skips and offering the same length of reign for each caliph. And we've not yet found anything that comes close. So this is also not really a certain point to follow up on. So both the very occasional Arabic words that crop up in his text and his reliance on a caliphal biography suggest that Ghevond was tapped into non-Armenian historiography, but they cannot substantiate the idea that Ghevond was familiar with the Arabic Islamic narratives. Tonight, though, I'd like to outline 2 episodes in Ghevond's history that suggest that there were in fact conversations that had taken place between the Armenians and Arabs in the 8th century, and that these allowed Arabic traditions to filter into the way that Ghevond talks about the past. First, the conquest of Ghevond, which happened in 640, and subsequently the Battle of Bagravand in 775. So we'll start with the conquest of Ghevond. An 8th century caliphal governor of Armenia rebuilt the provincial capital of Ghevond in 704. As rationale for his building program, he explains that he had been personally involved in the destructive capture of the city during the Islamic conquest in 640 when he was only 12 years old. The governor claims to have climbed the conduits and confused defenders by shouting out in his own language from the walls of the city. And thinking that the caliphal forces had breached their defenses, the Armenian troops protecting the city scattered and the city fell. Ghevond recounts that the source of this amazing story was none other than the governor himself from his own mouth. This passage is interesting to me for a number of reasons. So first of all, Ghevond, of course, wrote in 788, and so could not have known someone who was alive during the conquests. If the governor was 12 in 640, then he would have been a mere 160 years old when Ghevond was writing his history. But this passage suggests that stories about the past were told by word of mouth. And here we have confirmation in Arabic texts which frequently refer to the oral transmission of historical anecdotes. More importantly, the storyline fits seamlessly into the Arabic Islamic traditions about the conquests. So let's pause from Ghevond for a second and look at another story. The conquest narratives of Tustar, which is in modern Iran, share common elements with the governor's story, given that a local informant identified the city's water outlet for Muslim troops, who were then able to penetrate the city. Once inside, they signaled to the main army by shouting out, "God is great." And Tustar, like Ghevond, subsequently fell as the defense crumbled. Similarly, the governor of Syria, was able to subdue Caesarea in modern Israel when a local showed him an entry into the city via a conduit that was filled with water. Once inside, the caliphal troops shouted out, "God is great," and the Byzantine defenders fled. There are also other variations of the same motif, such as the conquest narratives of Ahmed, which is modern Diyarbakir in Turkey. A dog from the city unwittingly revealed the water drains to the invading forces, allowing a small group to enter into the city. The commanding officer sent a notice to the main general, "Be ready when you hear God is great," and the clamoring, and infiltrated the city. And as expected, the city then fell. So we could take the similarities between the conquest of Ghevond, as explained in Ghevond, and these conquest narratives of Tustar, Caesarea, and Ahmed in two different ways. So on the one hand, we might suggest that basically maybe the 7th century Near East just had a major problem with water conduits. Or we might also recognize that this is a sort of narrative motif, designed to celebrate the heroic actions of the conquerors instead of telling a story about what actually happened in the course of the conquests. So it's it kind of works as a soundbite of information that's passed around about a conquest, which people like Ghevond's governor might use by plugging themselves into a story that already existed. This suggests, as Ghevond himself says, with the comment that he heard from the governor himself, that the passage tapped into the Islamic historiographical tradition instead of the Armenian. There is one other example of this sort of oral transmission between Arabic and Armenian in Ghevond's text, a place where, and this is significant, he claims to have received information, quote, from the enemy himself. And this relates to the Battle of Ghevond, which Dr. Porta mentioned earlier as a watershed in Armenian history. Modern scholars tell the history of Ghevond exclusively from Ghevond's account. Ghevond specifies that the caliphal army was Khorasani and under the command of a certain Amr, identified as the Khorasani general Amr bin Ismail al-Harithi. In Ghevond's text, he says that the Caliph Mansur gathered the best cavalrymen, some 30,000 choice riders in heavy armor, from the regiment of the house of the land of Khorasan. He handed them over to a general, whose name was Amr, and sent him from the vast and famous city that Abdullah had built, fortified for safety and extremely strong and impenetrable walls, called by the name of Baghdad. The general rose up from the regions of Syria and arrived in the city Khilat, in the land of Armenia, very cautiously and readily armed. So the first thing that drew my attention to this was the phrase, "of the house of the land of Khorasan." Particularly because it appeared, and it also appears a few pages before this passage, but it was particularly interesting to me because it renders a phrase in Arabic, min ahl Khorasan, a phrase that literally means from among the people of Khorasan, but is used in medieval Arabic texts to refer to the Abbasid army. So already I'm inclined to believe that Ghevond, when he says that he heard this from the enemy himself, because he is using phrases that reflect the normal use of how these things are described in Arabic. So if we start here with just to keep an easy organization, this is how Ghevond argues, explains Ghevond. So a 9th century Arabic account, Lathari, explains that Mansur, the caliph, sent troops under a general named Amr bin Ismail, allowing the caliphal governor to defeat Mushah Mamagonian, who appears as Mushah al-Armeni. So at quick glance, it really seems possible, or plausible at least, that the Arabic may well corroborate Ghevond's story. And yet there are some problems with the version that we find in Ghevond. The first clue that there might be a problem with Ghevond's rendition is a chronological hiccup. Ghevond claims that the Battle of Vacca was on a Monday, the 14th of the month of Protis. Modern scholars have identified this as April 775. And Ghevond further claims that the reigning caliph received the curses of the prophet and died soon thereafter, desperately in the same year, confirming that the year was 775. And this is problematic because Amr ibn Ismail, the general here that Ghevond claims was at the battle, actually died in 774. The caliph himself had prayed over his body, and he was buried in the Abbasid family cemetery. So, assuming, of course, that Amr could not command the forces in Armenia after his own death, we are left either explaining away Amr's date of death as misinformation, or rejecting Ghevond's date for the battle, or revisiting the story in a broader context. And this is where we turn to Ibn Atham, a 9th century historian who wrote in Arabic. Ibn Atham describes 2 rebellions in Armenia. The first was in 774, led by the Sonaria, or in Armenian it's the Sonark, a Christian people who lived in eastern Georgia. Ibn Atham explains that the caliphal governor moved against them with a mixed army of troops from Syria, Iraq, and Khorasan, but was not able to pacify them, and so he wrote to the caliph to ask for reinforcements. And these came in the form of Amr ibn Ismail and 30,000 cavalry. So we might even speculate here that Ibn Atham is reporting the same story as Ghevond. He has 30,000 cavalry under the command of someone named Amr, who moved north by Mansur's orders. Ibn Atham, though, has Amr defeat the Sonaria and then return to die in Iraq in 774 without engaging with the Armenians at all. Ibn Atham then continues his discussion with the most detailed explanation of the Battle of Vacca that exists in Arabic sources. His account is really, really fascinating. So according to Ibn Atham, the son of the caliphal governor got into an argument with Mushekh Mamagonian. And in response, Mushekh gathered the Armenian nobles against the governor, inciting the Artsurnis to move against the caliphal army. And this is interesting because Ghevond doesn't mention the Artsurnis really at all in the Battle of Vacca. And so it either demonstrates his preference to narrate Vacca history or simply that he didn't have that sort of information available. He lists Artsurni dead as in the aftermath of the battle, but doesn't include them in the actual story. So the caliphal governor was not able to rally the forces again effectively against the Armenians in Ibn Atham's account, and so he wrote to the caliph to request aid. And this arrived in 775 in the form of 10,000 soldiers from Iraq, who rallied in Khilat, a detail that aligns with Ghevond's account. So after routing the Armenian army, the Muslim forces looted a Mamagonian church and beheaded the leaders of the Armenians, including Mushekh, and they sent their heads onto the caliph. Ibn Atham's next report is the death of Mansur, which is in line with the traditional date of Ghevond. So in short, our usual explanation of Ghevond is based entirely on Ghevond, so this version here. And yet I believe that Ghevond is confusing 2 separate reports as found in Ibn Atham. So he's picking out details from 2 different rebellions, one by the Sonaria and one by the Armenians, which, by the way, the Sonaria were understood as being part of Armenia, even though they actually fell in Georgian territory. And he melds them into one story. This suggests that Ghevond and Ibn Atham are part of the same narrative circles, reporting the same stories, and this same sort of process whereby details from one report will seep into the details of another. It's very well established in Islamic historiography, and particularly the genre related to the conquests, such as Ibn Atham's history. So reading Ghevond's text in conjunction with Arabic histories allows us to address chronological hiccups, such as Amr's appearance in the battlefield after his death, and it also allows us to fill in the blanks a little bit. So, for example, Ghevond mentions the involvement of a certain Mahmet at the Battle of Ghevond, but no one has been able to identify who this might have been. And Ibn Atham explains it quite clearly, though, that this is the son of the caliphal general, Muhammad ibn Hassan ibn Qahtaba. That is, the person who started the fight with Mushak Mamagonian in the first place. Reading Ghevond against the Arabic also, as we saw with the story of the conquest of Ghevond, allows us to see the repetition of narrative soundbites that jump from one context to another. So to sum up, Ghevond's history presents us with a tantalizing picture of an 8th century historian at work. Faced with the daunting task of illustrating the course of Armenian history under caliphal rule, Ghevond drew upon his native historical tradition for inspiration and information, but he also sought out conversations with alternative perspectives in order to enhance and enliven his story for his noble Vagratuni patron. Thank you for listening.
We do have time for questions. If people have any questions, happy.
Actually, I've got one question for each of you.
Okay.
For Professor Porta, could you explain the tax structure of the time? If you've come across it, was it an income tax or an asset tax, and put it in perspective of 20th century economics? And for Professor Vacca, when we see these numbers in antiquity, 30,000 cavalry, I mean, I really find that very hard to believe, because those are numbers that we did not even have during the American Civil War, where we used trains for transport. So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, you go for that's the easier one.
Yeah, of course. So the numbers aren't meant to be exact. They're not meant to actually tell us what happened. In many of the cases, it's a way to say it's a lot.
Okay.
What's interesting to me, though, is that they choose the same way to say a lot. So you can say 1,000 or 10,000 or 30,000 or 33,000 or 100,000. There are a lot of different choices of what you could do that show up quite a bit in the sources. What I find interesting, though, is that it aligns. And that's why I think the stories have jumped. So if it were in a vacuum, it doesn't tell us anything about how many people were actually there. It's what they're trying to get across. But what it also tells to me is the fact that they're choosing the same way of saying it's a lot, which would suggest, along with the other details when you line them up, that they're talking. They're using the same words to say a lot. So yeah, it's certainly not meant to imply that there are really that many people moving. It would be pretty shocking. You want to talk taxes?
Yeah, I'll talk taxes. My CPA told me. I mean, we don't have as much information as I would like to be able to tell you what you could deduct as an Armenian, whether if you had 2 chickens, you could deduct 1 if you gave it to charity. We don't have that. One thing I do know is, or at least not know, but one thing that's suggested is that under the original treaty that Theodore originally struck with the Caliphate, what there was a tribute, a set amount that was given every year that Armenia had to sort of cough up, and it wasn't very much comparatively. And their military, they had to take care, mainly the biggest expense was they had to take care of their own military expenses. And also, but they were also promised that their military would never be sent outside the bounds of Armenia, which was unusual, because one of the things that the Persians and the Byzantines used to do was take Armenian cavalry and send them either to the far eastern part of Iran to fight in Khorasan, or on the other hand, send them into the Balkans or even southern Italy. All right, so the Byzantines and the Persians, in fact, Sebios at one point says, why are, we don't know if this actually happened, but he basically says between the Emperor Maurice and Khosrow that they should get together and split the Armenians apart because they cause nothing but trouble between us, and so let's send half of them to the west and the other half to the east, and then we can just live peacefully with each other. This seems to change under the Marwanian reforms, and we seem to get a head tax with the census, and we have a tax collector that's now stationed in Ghevond. And this is where it seems to be that it's becoming much more exact. And it's not just that you have to show up with some, a relatively amount of silver to be given to the caliphate. There are also other problems. As you may know, that part of Armenia had very good silver mines. But there are times at which the silver disappears and they don't have access to it anymore, and they have to find it again. And so, it doesn't seem that the caliphate was always responsive to the idea that this vein ran out. And there would be periods in which they were not able to cough up as much silver as they were asked to. So much more beyond that, I don't think I can actually speak of. Do you have any more?
There are some studies that organize the taxation period for caliphal rule in Armenia along 5 different phases. This is based very much on Ghevond and the times when he complains. And with basically, if he's complaining about something, it's because something has changed. And I don't know that there's enough to substantiate that there are significant differences going on within the Marwanid period. I think the easier way is the way that we were talking about earlier, to say that the Sufyanids didn't really care very much. They didn't expect very much except for the military to stay up. But you also have censuses in the Marwanid period where they're checking to see who they could tax, basically. So you see more of an administrative backing for that, including tax collectors on the ground, instead of just expecting the Armenians to organize it and send the taxes in. So you have other people coming from outside.
Usually the first person to get killed was that tax collector in
Definitely.
Tvin. In each of those rebellions, the rebellion started with the tax collector getting his head cut. I think we can have some sympathy for them, but it's... Yes?
For that reason, did the caliphate have direct rule on the large cities like Ghevond? Because you mentioned the Barbertunis survived, and I imagine they were like a vassal lords that have to pay tribute. But what about in the cities where most of the
well, there's a change. Originally, there seemed to be garrisons that are in the cities, and there's the settlement of actual Arab tribes in Armenia seems to begin with the reign of Harun al-Rashid, which is after Ghevond, would be at the beginning of the next century. So until then, it depends on what there is. What do you mean by direct rule? There is a governor.
Was
The Armenians.
They started off as Armenians. They were appointed by the caliphate, but they were Armenians. But you do get times in which there's also an Arab Muslim governor as well. That also moves. That shifts, right? I mean, between the Prince of Armenia and
the Prince of Armenia. There was always a Prince of Armenia, but there weren't any non-Arab or non-Muslim governors appointed by the caliphate.
Yeah.
They appointed Arabs, some clients of Arab tribes, the Mawali, some Iranians, and there's even one Armenian who's a Muslim that they appoint in the later period after this. But they do have boots on the ground, and they do have tax collectors there. They do have an administrative presence in the cities after the Marwanid reforms. Beforehand, I mean, even Sebios' treaty straight out says we won't send troops. And so I think this is one of the reasons Ghevond is so supportive of Sufyanid rule, because they're not doing anything. They're not administering the cities, in person, versus the Marwanid. After the Marwanid reforms, they are, and there's much more meddling.
Just wondering about the sources that you were using. Was it Eastern Armenian sources, Western Armenian sources, and also what countries of Arabic origin did you get your information from?
The Armenian sources are all in classical Armenian, Karabakh. So they're all
from the writing that I saw.
Yeah. So it's all Karabakh. So there's no Eastern or Western. There's no dialectical difference at that time. At that time. So it's traditionally pronounced with Eastern pronunciation, because the phonetic shift seems to happen around the 11th to 12th century. We start seeing a phonetic shift, which then is fossilized in Western Armenian. We can see that because of spelling mistakes in Karabakh texts as well. So by this point, we only have the one pronunciation that we know of recorded.
For the Arabic ones, the vast majority of them, Tabari, Baladari, are all Iranian who are writing in Arabic. The exception for that is Ibn Akham, who's a really interesting personality. We can't really tie down. He's definitely Kufi, and he's an Arab. His history is a little bit harder to pin, largely because it's pulling together a lot of different stories and not established quite as well with the other written texts in Arabic. In terms of his material on Armenia, it's all conversational, including Bagravag, where he's telling stories of conversations that Mushak Mamagonian is having with this Muhammad bin Hassan al-Khattab. So his text is a little bit out there. It's different from the rest of them, and I don't think it's because he's Kufi. I think it's just because he's writing down earlier strains of material that have been changed by the time everyone else is writing. He's Armenian.
Professor, as questions you, while you were mentioning the languages, you mentioned Christian Arabic and Muslim Arabic.
Yeah.
So what was the difference between those two?
Yeah, thank you. There's no difference in the language. It is a difference in the community. So there is a Muslim version in the sense that they preserve Umar's critique of Christianity. The Christian Arabic sources that is a Melkite community. That's a community that is Christian but uses Arabic, just as Christians in the Middle East still do, right? They use Arabic. So they're writing in Arabic, but they're Christian. The manuscript is that's the one in Sinai. Yeah, that's the one in Sinai, but I think it's supposed to be Syria. It's originally Syria. Possibly it was written in Syria. They have Leo's response, which is interesting as well. We have a whole other project going on that's analyzing all of these different versions and planning to publish them together with a group of scholars. We've been meeting about that because this is a unique sort of correspondence that springs up across the Mediterranean in different bits. But Armenian is preserved the most. It's the largest of all of the letters because it has both the Muslim critique of Christianity and the Christian defense of Christianity. But it's clearly also a translation from Greek. Because the Armenian, if you read it, is not very good as Armenian.
And where is Khalat nowadays? The city of
Khlat.
Where is
Akhlat, on Lake Van.
it?
Yeah, it's Akhlat.
Nakhla?
Akhlat.
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 Very good.
Yep. And yes,
Yeah, so I was wondering, how can you tell that it's translated from Greek?
how can I tell? Right. First of all, if
If you don't have the original, right?
if you don't have the original, right? Well, first of all, there are things like it uses the word nomos, right, which is a Greek word, and for several texts, you can tell that it uses the Greek title for things rather than an Armenian title.
Okay.
That's one. But also, it's amazing what happens when you're translating this thing. You're going along translating the Armenian. You get to the letter, you start the beginning, and then all of a sudden it's like hitting a brick wall, where you're saying, how the heck am I supposed to translate that? Because the syntax and the grammar is weird. And so in some places, in order to get to it was a very methodologically it was very difficult decision to make. Do I try and render the Armenian as an Armenian would read it, which would be nonsense in English, or do I try to reconstruct the classical Greek underneath it in order to make a readable English translation? Right. And I don't know if I succeeded in that, but I tried to make it a readable English translation, and then in places I put things like, in Armenian this actually doesn't make much sense. But based on, it seems to represent this Greek phrasing, this Greek verb, which normally would not take this case in Armenian and stuff like that. It's like running right, you're like translating, it's pretty clear, everything's clear, and it's like hitting a brick wall. I have no idea what this means, like without studying it, which is really weird. It's an unnerving phenomenon. Yeah, right, they use the word for Septuagint, yeah.
They use the verses.
Yeah, right, right. Some of the Bible verses are from the Septuagint, as opposed from the Armenian Bible. Yes.
Dr. Porta, you mentioned that in Ghevond's writings there were not many references to the religious aspects of what was going on, and we understand that Armenia was not the only Christian state that was being governed under the caliphates. So is it our assumption then that there was not a large push to convert these at that time?
No, and the main reason for that is the more people who convert to Islam, the smaller your tax base.
Yeah.
Right? So there was not a large portion. Usually conversion was voluntary because you got it's a tax break, one. B, you're able to serve then in the administration, which you couldn't do otherwise, to a certain degree. It depends on where you are and when. I'm not going to push that issue. But there was no, that we know of, campaign of forced conversion.
So then those benefits didn't seem to be that enticing to try to convert. Just a natural conversion because you got a tax benefit, or wasn't enough then.
And the Umayyad period didn't actually get tax cuts.
No, in the Umayyad period there wasn't even a tax cut, but there wasn't also any. There's no sense that there's any desire to there's no real issue. I mean, obviously Armenians are, they do rebel and they are killed. And that happens, but there's never a point at which they say, this whole city must convert or we will kill it. There's no point in which they say that all the, that comes, there are things later on where they are brought in, when they're captured after a rebellion, according to the Armenian sources, that their nobles are said, convert or die. Right? So that happens to Simbat the Confessor, but that's later, and that's not in this period. Basically, they get their money, and that's it. Some people convert, some people don't, but we have very little information on conversion rates or demographics on that. I mean, we do know Armenians converted because we do have people called al-Armani in Arabic, which the Armenian. So, I mean, is there anything?
I think the usual thing is demographics. If you look at how many people are involved, they didn't have enough people to force Islam, so they also needed to make sure that they kept things relatively calm. I think so. I don't think there was much of a push at least in the Umayyad period.
But what's really also strange is that this is a period of intense argument within Christianity. Not only do you still have the whole argument over the Council of 451, you have within the people who reject Chalcedon, Armenians, certain Syrians, Copts, and there's this whole argument between the people who follow Julian of Halicarnassus and Severus of Antioch. And we have tons of treaties written by Armenians against the followers of Severus because they tend to be Julianists, and that Julianist strain survives. Nothing in Ghevond. I mean, this is a huge, huge debate. I mean, Hovhannes Maidagometsi is getting branded with a fox on his forehead because he's a strict Julianist, an extreme Julianist. And Hovhannes Oznetsi has this remarkable council in 726 where it basically says, this is what Armenian theology is going to be, this is canon law, and that closes the patristic period of Armenian church history. Not a mention by a priest, which is interesting. It's sort of weird. Likewise, the iconoclastic controversy over whether you can use images and pray to images. We do have other treaties in Armenian, revolving around this issue, particularly because Islam was aniconic. It is also relevant within a Muslim context of whether you can pray to an image or not an image, or whether you can have a painting or not. Nothing. So it's a very, he has one particular, focus in that sense of trying to present a specific type of history to his Bagratouni patrons. How the letter works into that is very interesting. All of that stuff not all of it. The icon issue happens within the letter, and other sorts of basic issues of Trinitarian and incarnation theology make it into the letter. But the letter is definitely not by Ghevond. So whether he thought like, hey, I covered my bases by including this letter, I don't know, because we're still not 100% certain that he included it. Any other questions? If not, thank you very much. Hope to see you for
Thank you, Dr. Porta and Dr. Vacca, for this very interesting and very unusual presentation in the sense that we don't usually have this period covered in our lecture series. So I want to thank you both for a very engaging presentation. I'd like to invite you all to have some coffee and cookies, and you can go ahead and ask questions to them. And in February the 6th, Dr. Ghevond Turkilmaz for the first lecture in his 3-part lecture series. So we'll see you then. Thank you.